We have a very, very special guest in studio today. WRHU's very own Michael Richardson, who also happened to be on the front lines yesterday, you could say, doing election coverage, right, like from 8 to 11. So I know there's some congratulations in order. Michael, great job, and on all the work that you do, especially election night last night.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Ronnie, and I do got to comment on Errol Levine. Yeah, complicated. It's a classic. It really is.
Can't go wrong.
You can't go wrong. You can't go wrong.
All right, Michael, we're going to let you do what you do best, and that's talk politics, talk the election coverage. We're going to spitball some questions at you, and, you just kind of give us some insight on somebody who was there on the up and up all night. So our first question for you were, what are some of the major trends that you noticed, whether it be, some certain states flopping, going a certain color, or, just basic voting trends on certain policies?
Well, let's start right here on Long Island, right? Because a lot of attention was put on the Suffolk County executive race. That was sort of the big election to watch on Long Island. And there was a lot of talk, is Suffolk really turning red? Because in 2020, you saw the former President Trump did so well in the county in 2016, but he only won against President Biden by roughly 200 votes. So is this turning red? But again, Lee Zeldin, who ran for governor last year, won there by double digits. Now we have the county executive-elect Ed Romaine, who beat his Democratic challenger Dave Colon by roughly 15 points with 100% of precincts reporting, and this is according to Newsday, roughly 40,000 votes. So now Republicans basically have control of all of Long Island. All 4 congressional seats, both county executive seats. And what that's going to translate to potentially is a district where I don't necessarily know if you'll see a lot of Republican candidates necessarily campaign here in 2024 for president, but it's going to be, people are going to be keeping an eye on Long Island, I think certainly going into the future, as to whether it could be, potentially a bellwether county for the United States. And I think on a national level, which I'm sure we can talk a lot more about because there's a lot to delve into, I think when you really look at the numbers and what specifically happens, I think there's a lot of people in the Democratic camp who are very happy with what happened. And I'll start with Virginia. There was a lot of talk, can Governor Glenn Youngkin run for president? Will he eventually do it? And what happened last night may very well diminish his chances because he lost his majority in the Virginia House of Delegates. Democrats are now in control, and Democrats are also still going to maintain control of the Virginia State Senate. There's a lot of talk about what would happen with abortion in Virginia. Would there be a ban? The Governor Glenn Youngkin talking about more of a limit rather than a ban on 15 weeks. I'll talk about education. Those initiatives may not necessarily go through anymore. And that may affect his approval rating, and that may affect, his political aspirations going forward. There's also Kentucky. There is what happened in Ohio, of course, with those abortion referendums. But I want to throw it back to you because, a lot to digest.
So how do you think that these results will affect the coming primaries?
I do think this could very well affect the primaries because I think abortion now, in case it wasn't obvious in 2022, is now an issue that's going to be center on voters' minds. You had Ohio have a ballot measure, issue 1, which want to establish a constitutional right to abortion. And just like a lot of we've seen in Midwestern states, namely Kansas, it went through overwhelmingly. I'm looking at the New York Times, which is getting votes from the Associated Press. And yes won by 13 points. It looks like just over, from my, quick math, roughly 500,000 votes. And Ohio is a state that sided with former President Trump by 8 points, both in 2016 and 2020. This is turning increasingly red. This for a time was the biggest bellwether in the United States. So I think all the parties are really going to look at what they do regarding abortion, because at the end of the day, this is delivering. This is delivering in the urban counties, and they're even going through and getting voters in the more suburban, rural areas where this issue may not have been, seemingly as prevalent years and years ago. So I think abortion is definitely going to be on the ballot. The same thing could be the case with the legalization of marijuana, which also went through in Ohio, but I think that may be a lesser issue on voters' minds. But look, I think the biggest question regarding 2024 is who the nominees are going to be. Certainly, former President Trump is in the front running for the Republican nomination. President Biden is far and away the front runner for the Democratic nomination. And if those two are the candidates, we see a lot of disapproval among Americans for those two in particular if there's a head-to-head matchup. So this could end up being an election that doesn't come down to policy. It comes down to character. So we may be talking about abortion. We may be talking about what's going on in Israel and Ukraine. We may be talking about gun control. We may be talking about other issues that are plaguing the country and the world. But at the end of the day, voters may not care about them so much when they're so partisan, when they care so much about who ultimately wins the election just because whether they're a D or an R.
And touching on Ohio and its decision, and mainly, abortion, a big buzzword topic, especially in this election. Do you think other states are going to follow in the footsteps of Ohio? You think they're going to take that as an example? And if so, how does that change the way that these candidates might want to work their campaigns?
Well, I think you've already seen a lot of states take it as an example because I believe every single time that abortion has been on the ballot in all these major states, the measure that ultimately restricted it less went through. I mean, you saw that in Kansas and states across the country. So I think that this will be an issue if it ends up going into the voters' hands. We could see more ballot measures. We could see, because we already see states like Florida, I believe like in Mississippi, where Republican Governor Tate Reeves just won re-election, albeit by a margin probably thinner than he wanted, where they're restricting abortion as early as 6 weeks. And if that comes to, and voters, head to the polls and have the ultimate say on whether that's enshrined in the Constitution, because that was a lot of talk about what happened in Dobbs, giving this decision back to the states. That was a lot of the proponents of it. If it ends up going back to the states, the voters may ultimately end up, enshrining abortion in their state constitutions. And if that's the case, again, this is an issue that is overwhelmingly polling well with Democrats, and it could very well be a lot on voters' minds heading into 2024.
Do you think abortion or what other major issues do you think would be on the forefront of voters and subsequently campaigners' minds at the time?
At what time? Right now or in 2024?
Right now or in the progression of a year or so?
So right now, I certainly think abortion really is resonating with a lot of voters, a lot of swing voters in particular. But again, it's going to come down, I think, to who the nominees are. Because if you have former President Trump on that Republican ballot, I think you're going to have a lot of people who are unwilling to vote for him no matter what, right? Because of what happened during his presidency, because of what happened on January 6th. But there's also a lot of people who are unhappy with the state of the country right now under President Joe Biden. People are struggling with higher prices. Of course, there's what's happening many miles from here in Israel and Ukraine. Some people don't approve of the way the president has gone about those initiatives. A lot of people don't approve of the amount of money that's going to Ukraine. So, and that's the interesting thing, if I may deviate a little bit, you're seeing in the GOP primary polls former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley really rise. And the reason for that is because of her experience with foreign policy. Because she can go up in front of these other candidates and say, look, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, you're doing well in your respective state, but what I have is foreign policy experience, talking with these leaders. A lot of people are driven to her now. She's polling quite higher than she was months ago because of what happened in Israel and Gaza. And when you combine that in Ukraine, foreign policy could actually be a big topic in this election. Let's say if she's the nominee for the Republican ballot, we're going to see a lot of talk about how she would handle those respective conflicts. And that could very well end up resonating. Voters may end up resonating more with her than the president, who some don't approve of what's going on right now. Now, look, a lot of issues in this country are incredibly polarizing. But when it comes down to it, when you look at the numbers, strong partisans have more of a majority, have more of a prevalence now than they ever did. You're really campaigning for those independents. And how those independents end up voting could very well decide the election.
And, touching on that, you've broken down some of the, the really big topics, the things that are going to change the look of the campaign and the political landscape as of right now. And kind of piggybacking off that, given your knowledge of the current political landscape, were there things that surprised you? Certain states that went a certain way, or policies that you didn't expect to have so much power, change voters' minds?
That's a great question. In this business, you almost can't be surprised anymore because of the amount of stuff, the amount of change that can happen. I think part of me it certainly is going to look more into what exactly happened in Kentucky, because this is a very deep red state, certainly on a presidential level. I mean, sided with former President Trump by more than 20 points. I believe it might have been closer to 30. And then you have this Democratic governor who is reelected, Andy Beshear, by a much higher margin this time around than in his first election. I mean, for a little bit of context, Beshear faced GOP current governor Matt Bevin in 2019. You want to know what the margin was in that race? 5,000 votes. 5,000 votes, less than a point. This time around, roughly 70,000 against Attorney General Daniel Cameron. And the reason that happened, Ronnie, was because of the margins in the big urban centers. He's not winning a vast majority of these counties, but counties like Jefferson, where Louisville is, where so much of the population is centered, his margin is 100,000 votes, 70 to 30. In Lexington, in Fayette County, his margin, 72 to 28. By my quick math right now, 45,000 votes. Those are enough to give him the margin. And when you look at why these candidates are resonating in these states that are solidly one way or the other, I think that's something that each party could look at very much going into 2024. I'm from Massachusetts. We just had incumbent governor Charlie Baker. He could have run for a third term. He was Republican, a Republican in a solidly blue state. And in his second election, he won overwhelmingly. So even though these states on a presidential level may very well be one way or the other, when you look at them sort of isolated, they're not immune to voting for the opposite party. And why those candidates do that, I think, is something that each party is going to look into. Beshear seen as more of a moderate Democrat compared to what you may see here in New York or in Massachusetts or across the Northeast. I think that's a big reason why he was elected, combined with his popularity. But certainly, I mean, he could be one that ends up running for president in the future. Yeah, we're going to need to see how candidates respond to what happened in this election. Maybe people, again, like Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, doesn't ultimately do a presidential bid after what happened last night. But certainly a lot to take down. I do want to give the note that it's been less than 24 hours. There's going to be a lot of analysis about what happened. There's still some more results coming in that we're going to see out of the Virginia state legislature in particular, although both majorities have been called for the Democrats. There's a lot to touch on, and certainly, we're going to be talking about what happened tonight as we head into 2024.
Now, steering back to more local election here on Long Island, what were some of the major issues or topics that you noticed surrounding this specific election?
The race I really covered was the Suffolk County executive race. I had the chance to speak with both the Republican and Democratic nominees. There was a lot of similarity between what they were talking about. They were talking about reducing crime, not making Suffolk a sanctuary county in their views. Addressing what's going on with so many migrants, which New York City Mayor Eric Adams has also commented on. The economy, how they can help voters' wallets. These are issues that voters went. The environment. The environment, of course, is a big one in Suffolk County. These are issues that voters went to the polls for. And ultimately, they resonated more with the Republican nominee, with Ed Romaine. Again, 57 to 43%. And then you also look here in Nassau, the town of Hempstead. Don Clavin, the current supervisor, overwhelmingly won re-election against Democrat Olena Nix. The town of North Hempstead, that was a very competitive race, and current supervisor Jen DeSena beat Democratic nominee and former North Hempstead town supervisor John Kamen. So I think that a lot of voters are looking at crime and immigration and the overall state of the economy. And those are issues that are polling well with the Republican Party. And those are issues that I think it's fairly clear to say resonated with a lot of voters last night.
And first of all, Michael, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come here and share your knowledge with us. We got one last question for you. Is there anything else that you'd like to point out, or any predictions that you'd have the knowledge to make an educated guess that you want us to look out for looking towards 2024?
Well, I don't know if I'll necessarily make a prediction, but I'll just say keep an eye on what happens, because local government can have a big say in what ultimately happens in your government. It can have a big say in what ultimately goes to the Supreme Court in what a lot of national politics is talking about. We were talking about last night a bunch, this debate between whether local politics has become nationalized. Whether you agree or disagree with that, there's going to be a lot of talk heading into 2024 about the respective parties and what they do at the local level to really try and drum up support. I guess I will give this prediction. Right now, I don't really see a scenario in which it is a landslide. With the current frontrunners, former President Trump and current Democratic President Joe Biden, the election's held right now. It's likely somewhat close. Actually, a year from now, it's likely somewhat close. So there's going to be a lot of campaigning, a lot of talking about those local issues, such as crime, like immigration, how people feel, well, this is more national, how people feel about democracy. I think it's important that people look at that and they ultimately decide, what resonates more with them, and that they go to the polls to let their voice heard. A lot to analyze. There's going to be a lot heading into next year, and I'm certainly excited to cover it. And again, I really appreciate you all having me on.
Well, we're glad to have you, Michael. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to us and share your knowledge of all the things that you learned on the front lines this year for election coverage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ronnie.